Yo, what's going on, boys? Welcome to the new channel that I'm starting up called the Juicecast. So most of you are probably coming from my main channel, Juicy MMA, which are kind of just shorter 8 to 10 minute videos. But for the Juicecast, these videos are essentially just going to be podcast style videos where I'm going to be talking about certain MMA topics that I want to talk about, maybe certain MMA fights that I want to talk about, and we're just going to have a longer discussion about a lot of these things. So in the first episode of the Juicecast, I want to be centering this episode around a couple of different topics, but the first topic I want to touch upon is the issues with the UFC. Because if you go around MMA Twitter, MMA YouTube, or just MMA fans in general as of late, a lot of fans are really starting to complain about the UFC. They're making claims that the UFC is just boring at this point. The UFC doesn't care about their fans anymore. Things are really starting to hit the fan, and a lot of fans are starting to completely not watch MMA or UFC fights anymore altogether. So before we get into some of the solutions for some of these potential issues, let's talk about the issues that many fans have with the UFC. Now, at this point, I think there's a few different things that fans are upset with the UFC about. For one is the overall card quality. Now, when you talk about a lot of these cards that have happened, at least so far to begin the year, they've been pretty poor. Now, if you watch some of my live streams and even some of my videos, I thought once the UFC moved over to Paramount, they would make a significant improvement to the card quality, especially for pay-per-view cards. But as we've seen for the first 3 months, that really hasn't happened. As if you take a look at the first card of the year, with the main event being Justin Gaethje versus Paddy Pimblett, that fight card was good. There definitely was some good names in the card, but the main event being an illegitimate title shot was not really that exciting. I mean, obviously, for one, there wasn't a champion fighting in that fight, but for two, it was an interim title fight being made between two guys that didn't deserve an opportunity to get an interim title shot. If there had to be an interim title fight at 155, Arman Shukin had to be involved. Paddy nor Justin Gaethje really deserved it. So from that perspective, that card was just okay at best. And then when you look at the next card after that, Volkanovski versus Diego Lopez, kind of a similar thing. Volkanovski obviously is a legitimate champion, one of the all-time greats, but at the same time, Diego Lopez just lost to Volkanovski not too long ago. So it was an illegitimate title shot opportunity for Lopez. And because of that, a lot of fans weren't too excited about the main event. And then outside of that, when you look at the rest of the main card or the rest of the card in general, it was very poor. And then most importantly, if you take a look at UFC 326, the most recent fight card, the main event was Charles Oliveira versus Max Holloway, which is a good fight, obviously, at least on paper. It was a really, really good fight, and fans were excited about that. But at the end of the day, it's a very similar thing where we didn't have a legitimate champion fighting on that card, and we didn't have a champion defending his belt against a very high-level fighter. It was for the BMF title fight. So a lot of fans had issues with that. And then, of course, most importantly, even outside of the main event, however you thought or whatever your thoughts were about that fight, the rest of the card was terrible. I mean, a lot of fans have been telling me the same thing, that UFC 326 was the worst pay-per-view card they've ever seen in their lives, and I don't blame them. I thought it was a very bad card as well. So all of a sudden, when you look at the card quality so far in the 3 months of the year, the first 3 months of the year, it's been pretty poor in terms of pay-per-view cards. We haven't, honestly, we have yet to see a legitimate title fight in the UFC. Now, obviously, a lot of fans will claim that the next card coming up in April between Yuri Prochazka and Carlos Ulberg is a legitimate title shot. But there's some caveats about that title fight as well. Alex Pereira knocked out Yuri Prochazka a couple of times. Now, I personally am still very excited about the fight. There's no question about that. But where's Khamzat Chimaev? Well, I know technically we are going to see him in for UFC 328, but before that, I guess is what I meant. Where's Khamzat Chimaev? Where is Islam Makhachev? Where's Ilia Topuria, who is fighting a little bit later on in the year? But at least for the beginning half of the year, a lot of these great champions were just not fighting at all or staying active, which is unfortunate. And overall, the card quality for the first 3 months of the year have been really poor. And of course, that's not even to mention the fight night cards. A lot of these fight night cards as well have been really poor. And that gets me on to my next reason for why, fans have issues with the UFC, and that's the Apex cards. Now, the Apex cards are something that had value at a certain point during the pandemic. They definitely helped out a lot. Obviously, they were still able to put on UFC cards when essentially every other major sport was not able to do so. So it definitely served a purpose at that time. But at this point, I mean, already for a few years, but especially at this point, the Apex has kind of run its course. Many fans are not that entertained or excited for an Apex card anymore. Usually the cards that they put together in the Apex are usually pretty poor cards in general because they know they don't need to sell to an arena or to a bunch of fans these cards. So at this point, the only real use case of the Apex is just to put together cards each and every week. But outside of that, they don't really put much effort into it. There's basically no fans. I know ever since this year started, that the capacity is a little bit higher. The Apex is, I guess, technically a little bit more fun, but at the same time, you're never going to match that same experience as compared to an arena card for a fight night. So the Apex is also another big issue that fans have with the UFC. And also, and the last point that I want to touch upon is the overall roster size. Now, I think this kind of comes back to the first point that I touched upon in terms of watered down cards. But when you talk about the UFC roster at this point, it's just way too big. How many fighters do they have at this point? 500? I don't know the exact number, but it's an absurd amount. On the Dana White Contender Series, it seems like if you win your fight in the Contender Series, you get signed by the UFC, regardless of how good or bad you look in those specific moments. And there's so many guys that are coming off the Contender Series at this point that are clearly not UFC caliber fighters, and it's a big issue. And even outside of the Contender Series, the UFC is just signing random guys that are clearly not UFC caliber fighters. And I think in turn, what we're really seeing is for these Apex cards, for these pay-per-view cards, even for some of these arena fight night cards, we're seeing a lot of fights consisting of one fighter or sometimes even both fighters clearly not being UFC caliber. And it overall waters down the sport. If you take a look back 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there were very rarely certain fighters on the roster that were legitimately not UFC caliber. But at this point, it seems to be a commonplace where every single fighter, maybe not every single fight, but every single card, there's at the very least one fight consisting of a fighter that's clearly not UFC caliber, which is unfortunate. And those are kind of the issues that a lot of fans have with the UFC at this point. And I think they're legitimate. I definitely do. Now, in terms of solutions to those problems, I think there's a few things you can do. Now, this is something that John Anik talked about recently on the Barstool podcast. I thought it was a very interesting topic, but essentially what he said is instead of having fight cards consist of anywhere from 12 to 15 fights, we should shorten them to 10 fights per card. Now, this will do a lot of good things for the sport. Now, for one, it'll shorten the length or how many hours these cards take, which would be a good thing, at least for the casual fans. As when you take a look at a lot of other sports, in particular baseball, they were trying to figure out anything they could to make their games a little bit shorter. And I think if the UFC can do a very similar thing with their fight cards, it would actually benefit and it would bring in a lot more casuals to the sport and, bring a lot more popularity to the sport. But for two, a big benefit of having 10 fights on a card as compared to the 12 or 15 we have now is that issue that I mentioned before. All of a sudden, a lot of these cards are pretty watered down with non-UFC caliber fighters, I should say, on a lot of these cards. But if you had 10 fights per card, all of a sudden you don't have to fill an additional 3 to 5 fights per card. And all of a sudden you can put together fights between two guys that are actually UFC caliber fighters and actually very high level fighters. So I thought John Anik's idea was tremendous. I mean, for me personally, I don't mind sitting down and watching a card for 6 or 8 hours, however long it takes per card. I personally enjoy fights. It's a great time for me. But in general, I think it would be a good rule for the sport and for the fans, especially for casual fans, but even for some hardcores. Even for me, I don't get that much joy out of watching certain fights where a certain fighter or maybe even both fighters are clearly not UFC caliber. So I do like the idea of John Anik, where he said we should, shorten a lot of these fight cards to 10 fights per card as compared to the 12 to 15 we have now. I think that's a legitimate solution. For the second part, also, I think the UFC's roster is just too big, as I touched upon before. If the UFC really started to cut a lot of these non-UFC caliber fighters and became a lot more stingy with who they actually signed to the rosters, once again, I think it'll force them to essentially put together fights between high-level fighters, which is something that a lot of fans have been asking for and clamoring for so long. But based upon the fact that you have the Dana White Contender Series, where it seems like everybody that gets a victory, and sometimes even guys that lose the fight get contracts, it just makes the roster a little bit too diluted alongside with additional guys they bring in on short notice and what have you. There's just a lot of issues with the UFC's roster at this point. And a big reason for why that is because it's just too many guys, too many fighters on the roster. And it's unsustainable to put on a great product week in and week out. So I definitely do think those are a couple of things that the UFC can do to otherwise make improvements to these issues that a lot of fans are having, because they're legitimate concerns. They definitely are legitimate concerns. Now, I will say this. There's fans on each opposite end of the spectrum. Either you're on this side and you say everything the UFC puts together is horrible, there's never a good fight card, or you're on this side and you say every fight card is really good, or most of the cards are really good, and the cards that aren't good are understandable because the UFC has to put on cards each and every week. For me personally, I'm kind of in the middle of both of those camps. For me, I think there definitely are certain fight cards that the UFC puts together that are good. Like, for example, UFC 327. I think it's very stacked, actually. UFC 328. I think it's a pretty solid card. Even the White House card. I think it's a very good card, actually. I know a lot of people are very disappointed about that White House card, and I know based upon the expectations that the UFC gave us, the card is not as good as we otherwise would have thought. I do agree with that, and I will admit that. But in terms of the card itself, regardless of the expectations, I think the White House card's a really good one. So there definitely are fight cards that the UFC puts together that are fun. And of course, that includes even fight nights as well. We have seen a lot of good fight nights in the past. But at the same time, there definitely are some things that the UFC can do to make their overall product better. And those are some of the things that I think they could do is what I mentioned before. Lower the amount of fighters that are on your roster, for one. Don't sign as many guys from the Contender Series just because they won the fight. Make sure they're actually high-level fighters and exciting fighters before you just sign all these guys to your roster, which of course would also lower the amount of fighters that are on your roster. But for two, I think it's a very simple thing you can do. Make your fight cards 10 fights as compared to the 12 to 15 that we have now. 5 fights for the prelims, 5 fights for the main card, and that's it. I think that'll honestly solve a lot of the issues that a lot of fans have with these cards currently at this moment. Now, I know it's a lot easier said than done. I know the UFC actually has to answer to, TKO, and maybe TKO wouldn't be happy about that, or maybe Paramount wouldn't be happy about that because less commercials. And, the UFC is kind of at this point where they do have to, please the donors, not the donors. They have to please the shareholders, I should say. So there definitely are multiple parties that are involved with this, and it's not as easy as just saying, okay, let's just strip these cards to 10 fights compared to the 12 or 15 we have now. I get it, but at the same time, I think if the UFC was really focused on the fans and really wants to put out the best product they possibly can, they'd figure it out how to put together a fight card that are 10 fights. You still can put a lot of commercials throughout those 10 fights on a particular card. And in general, I think the overall audience would be greater if you did that in the long run. But obviously, we'll see what happens if the UFC does make improvements. As I said, the cards are getting a little bit better. The first 3 months of the year are always terrible. The second half of the year is always significantly better compared to the first half. So we'll see as we get into, April, May, June time, as well as the end of the year. We'll see how the cards look at that point. But at this point, at least the cards that have already happened, they haven't been amazing. And there definitely are a lot of legitimate criticisms that fans have been giving to the UFC. Now, the next point that I wanted to touch upon is the fight between Sean Strickland and Khamzat Chimaev. Now, obviously, on my main channel, Juicy MMA, if you guys haven't seen that channel, be sure to check it out. The link will be in the description. But I will be putting out my full in-depth breakdown of this fight. But just to give you guys a little bit of a Cliff Notes version of it, I think Khamzat probably mauls Sean Strickland. It's an interesting fight. I think it's the most interesting fight you can put together at the weight class. I honestly didn't think the Imavov fight was too intriguing to me personally. It's unfair to Imavov. He definitely deserves the next title shot over Strickland. But nonetheless, in terms of the fight itself, in terms of the buildup, Strickland versus Khamzat honestly was the fight to make. But in terms of the fight itself, as I said, I think Khamzat mauls him. Strickland does have the best chance out of anybody else, and the way that Strickland could potentially win is force Khamzat to work early. And what I mean by that is, yes, Strickland's going to get taken down in the first round, probably in the first couple rounds, maybe in the first 3 rounds. We'll see. It's kind of inevitable. There's no really getting around that. Khamzat is the most elite wrestler and the most elite grappler we have in the UFC at this point, and especially in the first couple rounds, he's incredible. He's very difficult to stop, and there's honestly no way to stop him if you are Sean Strickland. So you're going to get taken down. But the thing that you would need to do if you're Sean Strickland is force Khamzat to work. Force Khamzat to work actually getting the takedowns for one. And if he does get the takedown, constantly be moving on your back, constantly try to be getting back to your feet. And that's something that I think a lot of UFC fighters don't do that effectively. When we see some of these strikers or some of these lower level grapplers, when they're going up against these high level grapplers, a lot of times they put all their efforts and all their work into takedown defense. But once they get taken down, they kind of just settle on their back. But that's probably the worst thing you can do. As soon as you get taken down, you have to constantly be moving to get to your butt, to get to the cage, to wall walk, get back to your feet, and defend the takedown from there and hopefully break into open space. Now, I will say Sean Strickland does a great job at that for the most part. A lot of guys have been able to take him down, Dricus du Plessis and some others. But the one thing that Sean Strickland does great is once he does get taken down, he does a great job at immediately getting back to his feet. So, as I said, I do think that Khamzat's going to find takedowns, but if you're Strickland, force him to work in those early rounds, force him to essentially tire himself out. And once you get to round 2, 3, 4, and 5, that's really where, if you're Sean Strickland, you can start to push a pace. You need to pressure. If you're Sean, you need to utilize your jab constantly, not just one jab and wait. You have to jab, 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 deep kick to the body, right hand. There's a lot of things you need to do in order to force Khamzat backwards if you're Strickland. And if Strickland can get to that point where he's in the third round, let's say, and he's doing a good job at pressuring Khamzat, there's a path to victory there. There really is. As Khamzat doesn't do a great job at fighting off the back foot, his striking, his offensive striking is dangerous and it's okay, I guess, but his defensive striking is really bad. I mean, even if you look back to his most recent performance against Dricus, he was laying on top of Dricus the entirety of the fight. But as soon as in that fifth round, in that tail half of that fifth round, as Dricus was able to get on the feet in space, he landed the first big right hand that he threw, and he landed it cleanly on Khamzat. If Khamzat didn't have a great chin, that would have been the most hilarious fight of all time, because Dricus would have won that fight if Khamzat didn't have an incredible chin. So defensively, there definitely are a lot of openings for Strickland, and also for two, Khamzat doesn't do a great job, honestly, especially when he's on the back foot, at diving under the punches and shooting in for takedowns. That's something that a lot of high-level grapplers have, but Khamzat doesn't really have that. The only way that he really finds his takedowns is when he's on the front foot and he's utilizing that lightning quick takedown attempt that he has in order to get you to the ground. But if you're Strickland and you can force Khamzat back, you can have a lot of success. So I do think there is a path to victory for Sean Strickland. It's going to be a lot easier said than done. The first couple rounds are going to be incredibly difficult for Strickland to, one, survive, but two, even make Khamzat work. Khamzat is just that elite of a grappler. But if Strickland can do that, once you get to the third round, he can start to pick it up. But with all that being said, I still do think Khamzat is going to win the fight. I still think that Khamzat is going to maul Sean Strickland. And in my opinion, my early prediction at this point would be, I think Khamzat is probably going to win this fight via a submission or a TKO finish within the first couple of rounds. But with that being said, even if that does happen, I think the fight is still worth it in the sense that the buildup is going to be really fun between both of these guys, and it is going to bring a lot more juice into that New Jersey card in general. The rest of that card is good, not incredible, but the main event is going to provide a lot of that juice for the card, and the fight itself is going to have a lot of aura, and it's going to be very exciting when these boys walk out. We'll see what happens, obviously, but I think you would have to favor Khamzat Chimaev at this point. But, the great thing about MMA is there is an obvious path to beating Khamzat. Nobody has been able to do it at this point. We'll see. Can Sean Strickland finally crack the code that is Khamzat Chimaev? But if Khamzat wins, I expect him to move up to the light heavyweight division. There's a lot of rumors that he was going to move up to the light heavyweight division even before this Strickland fight. But now that he is staying at the weight class, he is going to be defending his belt. I think if he beats Strickland, he moves up and fights Yuri, the winner of Yuri versus Carlos Ulberg, which I think it will be Yuri. But we'll see who it is, obviously, at light heavyweight. But it's an interesting fight, definitely, that is coming up. Another thing that I wanted to touch upon is Ilia Topuria. Now, a lot of people have been asking me about this on stream as well. A lot of people ask me, do I think Ilia Topuria has a real chance to become the GOAT of the UFC? And my answer is yes, 100% he does. He has a great chance to do so. And I think he can do so in 2 fights, as crazy as it may sound. I think if Ilia Topuria goes up against Justin Gaethje at the White House and knocks him out, which in my opinion is very likely to happen, then makes his move to 170 pounds, fights Islam at 170 and finishes Islam, or at the very least even beats Islam and retires after that, I think he's the GOAT. At that point, he would be the first triple champ in UFC history, for one. But for two, when you talk about the guys he was able to beat and the way he was able to beat him, it's honestly insane. He was able to, at that point, let's just say in that example, he would have been able to beat guys like Max Holloway, Volkanovski, Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, who, a little bit of an asterisk, but nonetheless, bigger name, as well as Islam Makhachev. That 5 list of guys to beat and especially finish, assuming that he finishes, let's say, Islam and even Justin Gaethje, that'll be one of the most incredible 5-fight stretches of all time. I mean, he's going up against all-time great fighters. Now, I know a lot of people will caveat that with saying Volkanovski was coming off a knockout loss not too long ago, and he was also old. People will also say Max Holloway, was moving. He was at 155, then he made the move back down to 145. That might have affected him. Then they say Charles Oliveira is out of his prime. Then for the Justin Gaethje fight, they'll say he's out of his prime, which is true. I will admit that one. And then for the Islam fight, they'll make some other excuse for that. in my opinion, I think it's all excuses. These guys are all-time great fighters. Charles Oliveira proved how great he was against Max Holloway. And regardless of what you think about Max Holloway's grappling, that was an incredibly impressive performance. So Charles, in my opinion, is still near the top of his game. Max Holloway, the same could be said. I honestly still think he's near the top of his game. And he showed that in that fight against Ilia Topuria. Definitely gave Ilia some trouble. And the Volkanovski thing, yes, he obviously was getting older. He was knocked out not too long ago before that Ilia fight. But nonetheless, if you just look at that fight stylistically, it's always going to be a fight that Ilia wins. Both those guys are incredibly technical, but Ilia just has the more power. And, Volk can land 10 shots, not really do much to Ilia Topuria, but Ilia can just land one shot and finish the fight, which is exactly what he was able to do. So I don't really buy into, all those caveats that a lot of people say about Ilia's resume thus far. But as I said, if he can beat Justin Gaethje by knockout and if he can finish Islam Makhachev, he's the GOAT at that point. And honestly, I don't even think it's remotely close. Now, I will say this. Obviously, that's a lot to ask. I think he's going to be Gaethje. Let's move on from the Gaethje point. But for the Islam point, that is a lot to ask. Islam is one of the best fighters in the UFC. Some will say he's the best fighter in the UFC at this point, for one. But for two, he's going to be a good amount bigger than Ilia. If you talk about Ilia, he's not even that big for 45. So him at 170 pounds would kind of be insane. And obviously, Islam is going to be a lot bigger, have a lot of strength, or you would think would have a lot of strength, physical strength over Ilia Topuria. But, if Ilia can do that, I think he's the GOAT. Now, in terms of the fight itself, Islam versus Ilia, you would have to favor Islam, especially at 170 at this point, but it's a much closer fight at this point than what it was just a couple of weeks ago. I think the Charles Oliveira performance against Max Holloway kind of showed you how good Ilia is, to be honest, in terms of his grappling, as Ilia was able to not only stuff the takedown from Charles, but he was able to actually get on top and get into the crucifix position pretty easily. So that was definitely a good aging win for Ilia Topuria. And because of that, it kind of gives me some hope that the fight could be pretty competitive between Ilia and Islam, even at 170. But obviously, we'll see what ends up happening if the fight ever does end up happening. And that's also another question that a lot of fans ask me. Do I think that fight is ever going to happen? And honestly, I think the answer is yes. I think there's a very good chance we see that fight. Two things need to happen, though, which is not a guarantee, but two things need to happen. Ilia Topuria needs to knock out Justin Gaethje. And for two, Islam Makhachev needs to beat Michael Morales. It's either Morales or Ian Gary. It seems like it's going to be Morales at this point. I don't think it's a guarantee that Islam beats Michael Morales, to be honest. I put out a video, talking about this already. I'll do my full in-depth breakdown when the fight officially gets announced. But not the easiest fight in the world, but assuming both those guys win their next fights, I think it's inevitable. I think Ilia is inevitably going to move up to 170 pounds, and Islam at that point would not be able to run away anymore and have some sort of an excuse, fight somebody else. It would have to be Islam versus Ilia. So although at this point, maybe it doesn't seem like it's incredibly likely that we'll see that fight next or anytime soon, I do think there's a very good chance that we finally see the fight between Ilia and Islam. And whoever wins that fight is going to have a lot of bragging rights for, the bit of a rivalry between Georgia and Dagestan, for one. But for two, whoever wins that fight can easily call themselves the best fighter in the UFC currently and one of the greatest fighters of all time. If Ilia wins the fight, I think he's the GOAT. If Islam wins the fight, he's already one of the greatest fighters of all time, but he climbs even higher in the rankings if you're Islam. So obviously, an incredibly high-level fight. I think there's a great argument to be made that it'll be the highest-level fight of all time. So obviously, a lot of fans want it. I also want the fight a lot, but we'll see if we actually get it. Things have to pan out in our favor, I guess. But a real possibility. If I had to say percentage-wise, I think about like a 60% chance we see that fight, maybe 65% chance we see that fight. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I do think we see the fight, if we're going to be completely honest. So we'll see what happens there, obviously, as well. But yeah, boys, this is the first episode of the Juicecast. I hope you guys enjoyed just rambling about a bunch of different MMA topics. In terms of the schedule for these sort of videos, I don't really have it hashed out yet at this point. At this point, I'm kind of planning just I'm doing once per month, obviously, on my main channel. That's my main focus. And you're going to see the normal 3 videos per week, 3 shorts per week, and 5 live streams per week on that channel. That's obviously my main focus, and I'm not going to take away from that channel. But for this channel, it's just kind of, a laid-back experience where I just ramble on about MMA topics. So I'll figure out and hash out my actual schedule for this. At this point, it's going to be once a month. But if I like it, if you guys enjoy these videos as well and want more, be sure to let me know down below in chat. And I will be making this, more frequent of a thing. But anyways, boys, that was episode 1 of the Juicecast. I hope you guys enjoyed. And until the next time, peace out, fellas.